Alright, now in this video we're going to be going over what are called conditionals, conditional statements, and as is always the case, I will be able to be saying various different things throughout the video to allow you to put in those items and get yourself an easy and free 100. So on our uses of the subjunctive, you can see them right here. So you have these conditionals. Now, every single conditional is going to involve two clauses. And you have encountered them before. However, when you have encountered your conditionals, it was probably presented to you in math class as if-then statements. First and foremost, what you have to do is you have to start getting used to terminology. So, you know that you have a conditional because you're going to see the words see and nisi. And that mean if and if not, or sometimes unless. Now, when you have that, we can call that the if clause. And that's the subordinate clause, but I don't want you to do that. I want you to know that the if clause is going to be known as the protasis, and the then clause is going to be known as the apodosis. Now, the then is going to be always written as with, of course, parentheses, because you do not need the word then. If it is raining, then the ground is wet. Well, you don't need the then. If it is raining, the ground is wet. And so I've just made a conditional, and obviously the two clauses. It's the then clause, which we will refer to as the apodosis, which is the main independent clause. And so that is what you need to know first and foremost is the terminology. And so your first word to put in is going to be protasis. P-R-O-T-A-S-I-S. Now, a word before we move on of see and nisi. This seems an appropriate time to point out that four words, see and nisi, and the word noom, which of course is going to imply a question that has a no answer. It is the opposite of none. And then ne, which we see many oftentimes as the word that is the negative counterpart to ud. All the ollies fall away. See, nisi, noom, and ne, ollie goes on holiday. By that I mean is that when you have the word aliquis, which is someone or anyone, somebody, anybody, it's masculine and feminine, and aliquid, something, anything, then what happens is that if it is hanging around these four words, the ollie will disappear. And so we'll see an example of, obviously, of si aliquis or si aliquis, because it is going to be aliquis, aliquis, aliquid. The genitive is going to be aliquis, aliquis, aliquis. The dative is going to be aliqui, 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 and the aliquim, aliquim, aliqui, and so forth and so on. But nevertheless, be aware that si, nisi, noom, and ne, all the ollies fall away. Si quis, if somebody, if anybody. Si quid, if something. Now, first thing to know about the conditions is that they are divided into two parts, or two divisions, two types. You have the real conditions, and you have the imaginary or contrary to fact conditions. Now, when you are dividing these up, it is an easy way to think about it. The real conditions are the real world, and so they will all have indicative verbs, and that's how you tell what kind of clause or what kind of conditional you have. It is that you are going to be looking at, is it a clause, protasis and apodosis with indicatives, or clause, protasis and apodosis with subjunctives. If you have indicatives, they are the simple ones. And then we have a further division that you have conditionals that are known as present conditions, past conditions, and future, which means that there are 6 total conditionals. So let's quickly run through the real conditions because they are intuitive. Just as you would expect, you would use for a present simple, present real, present indicatives. And you just simply say, if the subject verbs, the subject verbs. If the subject is verbing, the subject is verbing. If the subject does verb, the subject does verb. So, if the students study, they make good grades. If the students are studying, they are making good grades. If the students do study, they do make good grades. And it is intuitive, and you just translate it like you would expect it. Same exact thing for past real. If the students were studying, they were making good grades. If the students studied, they made good grades. If the students did study, they did make good grades. It is a real condition. Likewise, the future. Now, your second item that you're going to be putting in is apodosis, the main clause of a conditional. A-P-O-D-A-S-I-S, apodosis. Now, the future real has another name, and the other name that it goes by is the future more vivid. Write that down on your study guide, because again, you need to be familiar with terminology, because it's these terms that I use, and if you don't know what that means, then you are going to be doomed. You must know that the future real is the same as the future more vivid. And here in the protasis, you will find that you will either have a future or a future perfect, and then you will have a future in the apodosis. Now, the way you translate it is going to be if the subject verbs. Now, if I were to have crutch out the word if, the subject verbs, that is an action that is present. Once you put an if in there, you don't know whether it is present if the subject verbs. You only know when you get to the apodosis, the subject verbs. But here, if the subject verbs implied in the future, the subject will verb. And so here we have in the protasis, if the student verbs, studies, the students will make good grades. If the students study at some point in the future, they will at some point in the future make good grades. So, it's intuitive, but it's also not as appealing as the world of imagination. Now, the subjunctive conditionals are, like I said, counterintuitive. You don't go present, present, past, past, future, future. Instead, you must understand that in a present imaginary, you're going to have imperfect subjunctives. Now, if you were to say the subjects were verbing, so the students, I've already written it for you here. The students were studying. Well, yeah, that's going to be past. Was verbing, were verbing in the past. But once you are subordinating it with the word if, once you turn it into a protasis, you can imply that it's a made-up action right now. And so you would say, if the subject were verbing right now, he or she or it is not, but if the subject were verbing right now, then the subject would verb right now. And that's what we have here. If the students were studying right now, this year, present tense, they're not, but if they were studying, then they right now would make good grades. And so that's how you translate it. Subject was verbing, subject would verb. Were verbing, would verb. Were verbing, would verb. Now, you have the past contrary to fact, or past imaginary. And by the way, again, terminology. I sometimes call it imaginary, sometimes call it contrary to fact. You use pluperfect subjunctives. And so you would say, if the subject had verbed, they didn't. Yesterday, they didn't. But if they had, this is the imaginary part, the imagination. So here, if the students had studied, they didn't, they would have made good grades in the past, back in 20 whatever. If my students had studied, they didn't. If they had, then they would have made good grades. And so we're making up a contrary to fact imaginary condition of the past. Then we have the future imaginary or future contrary to fact. But again, most of the time, this one for the future, which has present subjunctives in both the protasis and the apodosis, is referred to, since this one is the real one, the future more vivid, this one is going to be the future less vivid. And that's your third item, vivid. V-I-V-I-D, vivid. Now, it is the should-would. So, if the students should study at some point in the future, they won't, but if they should, then at some point in the future they would. Now, instead of should, we can also express were to. But the key is you gotta have that to with the word would. If the students were to study at some point in the future, then they would make good grades at some point in the future. But I prefer the should because it's easier to memorize that when you see present subjunctives in the protasis and the apodosis, that the English expression is should, would, as it were. So, that is what we need to remember. There are two main divisions of real conditions and imaginary conditions. Subjunctive over here, imaginary, indicative over here, the real ones. And again, remember, si, nisi, num, and nay, all the ollies fall away, and that's your fourth item. Num, N-U-M. Now, let's just take a look at the first three. Again, what are we going to do? We look at what verb we have in the protasis and what verb we have in the apodosis. Since they are pluperfects, this is past contrary to fact, and so we say, if anybody had killed Octavian, they did not, but if they had, we're making it up, that's why we're using subjunctive, the republic would have fallen in the hands of Antony and Cleopatra. That did not go down, but we're making it up. If I look at what kind of verb, imperfect subjunctive, then I look at what kind of verb, imperfect subjunctive, a present contrary to fact. If Augustus were not ruling the empire well, he is, so we're making it up. If he were not ruling it well right now, then the Senate right now would make a conspiracy against him. We're making it up subjunctives. Likewise, number three, Gerot, Gero, Gerere. We fear a giant liar. Wincot, what main clause, the apodosis gets blue always. So winco, wincare. We fear a giant liar. So since I have present subjunctives in both the protasis and the apodosis, this must be a future less vivid. If Trajan, at some point in the future, he won't, will or not will, should wage war against Dacia, that's a country, he would win very easily. So that's it. Your final item is would. W-O-U-L-D. The helping verb you use for both the apodosis of the present, contrary to fact, and the apodosis of the future, less vivid. Would. So hopefully this will help you out and get you some easy and free 100s.